beauty within the content that I've learned, particularly in UWC and here, is realizing how similar the languages are. We come from relatively the same tribes originally. It's so beautiful to me how my Swazi sisters will speak to me and I can gather what they're saying. They're speaking in their native language, but I can gather what they're saying. Where I could speak to someone from Zambia in my native language and they can kind of gather what we're saying. In as much as there's beauty in that, it also makes me very introspective in the sense that that comes from my privilege of knowing my native language and knowing it intimately enough to be able to see the similarities in another language. And so I think there's great possibility in being able to have conversations across the country. You don't necessarily need to speak your language. So that also comes from understanding your history and whatnot, which unfortunately is within the colonial languages. As a continent, even though we started speaking English more or speaking French more, we started revering it more. Because of that works in the opposite direction. So I'll give an example of Cecil John Rhodes. South Africa, a few years ago, there was a hashtag Cecil must fall. Simply because in academic institutions within the continent, you're seeing your white colonial images in the libraries, you're seeing them in your lecture halls, so all the places that you're taught to acknowledge as these great focal points of education, the focal points of growth and development, and what should be the core to your own trajectory as a young person. You're waking up to Cecil John Rhodes. You're walking into a statue of the Queen. Things where, for example, the Queen sat at this restaurant back in 1970 something, but the place where your president sat last week, you can come and sit there. Because we started revering those things, that's where we started revering the Western perspective. Wherein English isn't necessarily a tool now for us, like a drug. We're like, okay, now that I speak English, then the ideas that come with it also, I must adopt them. In as much as it works in the opposite direction, I give credit to our current generation. First of all, we're having this conversation. So we're acknowledging something is happening. But with the hashtag Cecil must fall, we had students going into academic institutions pulling down the images of Cecil, simply to say that in as much as education is a tool for me, it shouldn't necessarily take away from my identity as much as it's giving to my perspective.
I think a big reason why we have come to shape our conception of what valid knowledge is, or only limited to colonial language knowledge, is also opportunities within our home country. So for example, for me in Egypt, the government doesn't give you enough opportunities to get a proper education. The education isn't proper even if you are extremely wealthy and is willing to pay in an American or a British or a German institution back home. Still not an adequate education quality. The lack of opportunity pushes a lot of talented and gifted people, which is completely ignoring everyone else who's not considered talented or gifted by the standards formed by the current economy. It pushes these people to study abroad because there are countries that are giving the opportunities that Egypt isn't able to give, also considering the political and economic situations. So that doesn't only snatch away a lot of opportunities from every Egyptian, it also gives an opportunity to a very select few who proves worth of opportunity through very selective standards. And I think you both could relate to that through the selection criteria of UWC. Why are we selected and other people aren't? But when people go to study abroad, they are kind of forced to write their research in English since their home institutions are mostly English, to read research papers in English, to study in English. So it's not only defining it as valid knowledge. I think we can have the conception of knowledge in Arabic is valid, but how far does it get me? How far is my government facilitating opportunities for me to share my knowledge in Arabic and gain knowledge in Arabic? Their translations of the huge knowledge body that is in English and French right now into my native language. There are so many intricate aspects involved on what defines valid knowledge for us, just rather than thinking of colonial languages as superior and hence their knowledge is superior. I feel like it is also so forceful through a lot of socioeconomic and political factors. But that could also be very limited to Egypt, but the patterns within the continent, I feel that maybe there could be a similarity in Cameroon and Zimbabwe.
I don't speak my language and I'm not proud of it. However, I would like to emphasize that, for example, within Cameroon, the language are not that closely linked together. So I have some sense of it. Within my ethnic group, there will be a lot of similarities between our different languages. When I step out of my ethnic group into another ethnic group, there's this disconnection within the language. The words are not similar anymore. It's true in some cases that you feel connected with other people through languages because you can at least identify the similarities and differences within the language, but in other cases, there's a sense of disconnection because as long as I can identify to my people within my ethnic group because the language are a bit similar, still within that same country, another ethnic group is speaking a completely different language, which I won't even have a sense if I was into a conversation with them. I think it's important for all of us to be able to speak our language, but then we are back to the conversation of how do we communicate if you have different language. The countries that you mentioned even are close by country, Eswatini, Zambia, still within Southern Africa. I'm talking about one country, Cameroon. I'm unable to relate with another person tribe, another person language. As much as we want to maintain our different languages within our different tribes and country, I think there's a need for us to emphasize on one language within the continent for communication.
It's not only using the community as a tool, but it's also using the community as an environment, as a classroom. So how can we see the community, as we define community, as something worth learning within, as something worth exploring, as a valid education? And that's also like what's valid knowledge, right? It's a loophole. But for example, I think of my hometown. I come from a smaller city northwest of Cairo, and it is one of the cities very famous for cotton production and fabric production. When I think of how I learned about cotton processing or fabric, I don't remember because I just memorized some words in a textbook. Meanwhile, I have like 5 factories in my hometown that my school could have gone to or I could have gone to. The community could have offered as learning resources if we had this community urbanization mechanism. And I think if I would have seen the machines and what they do and the process cotton or raw material goes through to become the clothes we wear, I think I wouldn't have forgotten it. There is a lot of valid knowledge in the practicality and practical knowledge that our community offer us.
I think it plays into the critique on how we view education as a whole. How do we nucleate education in society and then kind of develop and then use education as a tool? Currently, the structure of education that we have is very Western, where it's very limited to specific ways of knowing. How I understand color, I feel, is not in English. It's hard for me to relate to a color or to the natural environment in English in as much as I do in my native tongue. And so now we're speaking of a different way of knowing. If we're speaking about, for example, geography, why are children on the African continent not going to see granite mountains but are looking at pictures of granite mountains? And make education more immersive. You're not doing that because you're teaching from the perspective of the Western education system. When they need to show you pictures of V-shaped valleys, well, you can take me downtown to the V-shaped valley that's down the street. Africa kind of believes that we're playing catch up with the rest of the world, where in actuality, we're doing this. We were always doing this. There was a point where we were taking this way. And we can say, no, actually, how we would like to teach is in this manner. How we would like to teach history is in this manner. That's another thing wherein history is very first world centered. Like, oh, this accidentally happened. Somehow Vasco da Gama found himself there. Somehow this happened. At least when I was in high school, the professor made a very distinct line and said, so I'm going to teach you history from our perspective. And then proceeded to open the textbook and said, okay, so now we'll learn history how the West would like us to learn history. And I think understanding that difference, where the best way for us to teach and to move forward as a country and as a continent is in this manner, will take a lot, but it's rewarding in a certain manner because those ways of knowing aren't necessarily that reality, as you would say, isn't necessarily applicable for ourselves and won't necessarily lead to development for us, but might just lead to education, where an education should help you develop.